French President Emmanuel Macron stood before cameras and spoke of Africa with contempt. In his words, Africans were less than human. Not partners, not equals, just subjects to be managed. For many across the continent, it was not surprising. For centuries, European leaders have spoken with the same arrogance. But this time, something happened that nobody expected. On a quiet morning in the heart of West Africa, history turned. The city of Ouagadougou, capital of Burkina Faso, was just waking up. Street vendors were setting up their stalls. Children were heading to school. But behind the closed doors of luxury hotels, a different drama was unfolding. At exactly 6 in the morning, the silence was broken by sharp knocks, heavy boots, and the click of handcuffs. One by one, the world's most powerful mining executives were dragged from their suites. These were not small figures. They were the men who had sat in boardrooms in London, Toronto, and Sydney. Men who controlled billions of dollars in gold and resources pulled from African soil. For decades, they had been untouchable. They traveled in private jets, lived in guarded compounds, and treated countries like Burkina Faso as colonies to be exploited. That morning, everything changed. The head of Goldmax Corporation was seized in his hotel room. Still in his nightclothes, the CEO of a Canadian mining giant tried to escape to his waiting jet, only to be stopped on the way to the airport. Another executive, from Australia, was caught frantically typing on his laptop, trying to wire money out of the country before the walls closed in. None of them got away. It was not chaos. It was not coincidence. It was a masterpiece of planning. At the center stood one man, President IBRAHIM Traoré of Burkina Faso, calm, young, determined. For months he had been preparing this strike in silence. Few in the world even knew his name. But on this morning, every newswire and every television channel would speak it. The arrests sent shockwaves across the globe. In European capitals, government officials rushed into emergency meetings. In New York and London, the stock prices of mining corporations began to tumble. Analysts scrambled to understand what had just happened. How could one of the poorest nations on Earth detain the leaders of multi-billion-dollar companies? How could this small, landlocked country suddenly challenge the entire global order of resource exploitation? For ordinary Africans, the answer was simple. Finally, someone had the courage. Finally, a leader had dared to do what others only whispered about. The sight of foreign executives, once worshipped as kings, now sitting in handcuffs, was more than news. It was justice in motion. And so the story begins, not with another empty speech, not with another broken promise, but with action, bold, dangerous, and irreversible. On that morning, Burkina Faso sent a message that echoed far beyond its borders. The days of unchecked plunder were ending. This was only the beginning. The arrests did not come out of nowhere. They were not a burst of anger or a desperate gamble. They were the result of a plan, carried out in silence, hidden in the shadows. Months earlier, President IBRAHIM Traoré had ordered something bold, a full audit of every foreign mining operation in the country. For years, rumors had spread about stolen gold, false reports, and money that disappeared before it ever touched the national treasury. But no leader had ever dared to confront the companies directly. They were too powerful, too connected, too dangerous. Traoré did not hesitate. He formed a special task force, made up of experts in finance, law, and resource policy. They were not politicians. They were investigators, accountants, lawyers, people who knew how to follow the paper trail, how to uncover the lies buried in spreadsheets and contracts. Their mission was simple: find out exactly how much gold was leaving the soil of Burkina Faso and how much money was being stolen. The team worked in total secrecy. For 6 months, not a word escaped. While the world slept, they moved quietly. They demanded 10 years of financial records from every mining company. They planted informants at the mine sites. They flew drones over open pits, taking high-resolution images of trucks and stockpiles. They pulled satellite data, comparing what the satellites saw with what the companies claimed on their books. Piece by piece, the truth began to emerge, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. For over half a century, foreign companies had been pulling unimaginable wealth out of Burkina Faso. Gold worth hundreds of billions of dollars, yet only a tiny fraction ever reached the people. The rest vanished, siphoned off into offshore accounts, hidden behind shell companies in Switzerland or the Cayman Islands. The scale of the theft was staggering. In some cases, companies were underreporting their production by as much as 90%. 9 out of 10 ounces of gold never appeared in official records. On paper, it was as if they had never existed. But the satellites, the drones, and the miners on the ground told a different story. The gold was real. The theft was real. One case stood out. A giant mining company had reported only a small amount of production from one of its largest mines, yet the images showed convoys of trucks moving day and night, carrying far more than was declared. In a single year, the company had pulled hundreds of millions of dollars in gold from the ground. But the government received almost nothing. For decades, this had been the pattern. Wealth out, poverty in, companies grew rich, communities grew poor. The system was rigged, and everyone knew it. But now, for the first time, the evidence was undeniable. By the time the task force finished its work, Traoré held in his hands a weapon more powerful than any gun: the truth. He knew exactly how much had been stolen, exactly who had stolen it, and exactly how long it had been happening. All that remained was to act, and when the moment came, he did not hesitate. The deeper the investigators looked, the darker the picture became. What they uncovered was not a few accounting errors or small tricks. It was an entire system of fraud, built over decades, designed to rob Burkina Faso blind. At the center were the mining companies. On the surface, they looked legitimate. They held glossy press conferences, produced polished annual reports, and talked about corporate responsibility. But behind the curtain, the reality was brutal. These companies operated like organized crime syndicates, only wearing suits and ties instead of masks. One company reported only a fraction of its production. If 10 truckloads of gold left the mine, only one appeared in official records. The other 9 vanished into the black market, loaded onto private jets, hidden in shipments, or quietly transferred through offshore accounts. Another company created fake invoices. On paper, they sold bars of gold for a small fraction of their actual value. They claimed massive losses, while in reality, the gold was smuggled out and resold at full price overseas. It was theft disguised as trade. Then came a scheme even more cynical. At one mine, the company inflated its workers' salaries on paper. On the books, miners were supposedly earning 10 times what they actually received. The inflated wages were then claimed as tax deductions. The company pocketed the difference, while the miners themselves remained dirt poor, earning barely enough to feed their families. And if that wasn't cruel enough, the environmental crimes were staggering. Some corporations dumped toxic chemicals directly into rivers. Cyanide, used to extract gold from ore, seeped into the water that people drank, bathed in, and used to grow crops. Entire villages were poisoned. Cancer rates skyrocketed. Children died before reaching adulthood. Yet in the internal memos, executives dismissed the deaths as acceptable losses. The corruption did not stop with the companies. It reached into the highest levels of government. Ministers accepted briefcases of cash. Presidents' relatives were bribed with millions in exchange for licenses. Laws were rewritten in the middle of the night to slash taxes, hand out land, or look the other way when whole communities were displaced. One official, a minister of energy, accepted a bribe so enormous it reduced the country's mining tax rate from healthy double digits down to almost nothing. That single deal cost Burkina Faso billions every year. Another bribe to a president's brother secured licenses for 3 new mines. The result? Tens of thousands of villagers were forced off their ancestral land, their homes bulldozed, their communities erased. This was not mismanagement. It was not incompetence. It was deliberate plunder, organized at the highest level, carried out with precision and arrogance. For ordinary people, the consequences were devastating. Miners worked themselves to death for pennies. Families lost their homes. Rivers turned to poison. And while foreign companies grew rich, entire generations of Burkinabe remained trapped in poverty. It was more than theft. It was betrayal. A betrayal not only by outsiders, but by the leaders who were supposed to protect their people. And it could not go on forever. Once the evidence was in his hands, President IBRAHIM Traoré knew he could not wait. Every day that passed meant more gold stolen, more rivers poisoned, more families forced from their land. The time for silence was over. He chose action, swift, bold, and impossible to ignore. Standing before his nation, Traoré spoke words that echoed across the continent. He declared that the gold ripped from Burkinabe soil, carried away by sweat and blood, was now locked in foreign vaults. And while the people starved, others grew rich. That ends today, he said. His message to the mining executives was clear. Return what you have stolen or spend the rest of your life in prison. This was not empty talk. The arrests at dawn proved it. Traoré had turned words into deeds, and the world was stunned. The international reaction came fast. In Europe, leaders gathered for emergency meetings. In Washington, stern warnings were issued. The European Union accused Traoré of destabilizing the global market. American officials threatened sanctions. And French President Emmanuel Macron, furious, went on record with a threat: "You will pay for this." But Traoré did not flinch. His reply was sharp, unshaken. "Say colonizers, not investors. Real investors are welcome. Thieves in suits, never again." Then came the United States. President Biden announced that American aid could be cut off. To that, Traoré simply laughed. "Which aid?" he asked. "The few crumbs you send each year? We will make our own wealth from our own gold. Keep your aid. Give it to your puppet states." Western media tried to frame him as a dictator, a reckless populist playing with fire. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, the story was very different. Crowds poured out by the hundreds of thousands. Farmers, miners, teachers, elders, all together. They raised their fists, waved their flags, and held banners with one simple message: "Our gold is ours." For the first time in living memory, the nation felt united. Voices from the villages brought tears to the capital. An old miner with calloused hands and tired eyes stood before cameras and said, "For 40 years I pulled gold from the ground. Europe grew rich, but my own children never went to school. Finally, someone is fighting for us." Even as the West rattled its threats, the people of Burkina Faso answered louder. They filled the streets with songs, drums, and chants of Traoré's name. This was not fear, it was pride, it was dignity returned. And as the cameras rolled, the world saw it clearly. Burkina Faso was no longer bowing. It was standing tall, unafraid, and determined to fight back. The counterstrike had begun. The arrests were only the beginning. The true test came when the trials began. For the first time, the world's most powerful mining executives would stand in an African courtroom, facing charges not in secret tribunals or foreign capitals, but on the soil they had exploited. President IBRAHIM Traoré made a critical decision. He refused to let Western influence dominate the process. He created a special court, independent, transparent, and unmistakably African. The bench was made up of 7 judges, 3 from Africa, 2 from Asia, and 2 from Latin America. No European, no American, no backdoor lobbyists. Justice would be delivered by those who knew what it meant to be exploited. The charges were overwhelming. Each executive faced a thick file stacked with evidence. The head of Goldmax was accused of hundreds of counts of tax evasion, bribery, illegal land grabs, and the displacement of entire communities. The CEO of Western Gold faced charges of child labor, forcing children barely 12 years old to work underground for endless shifts in suffocating tunnels. Another executive was indicted for knowingly approving mining methods that poisoned rivers with toxic chemicals, leading to mass illness and death in dozens of villages. But what shook the courtroom most was not the paperwork. It was the testimony. One by one, victims stepped forward. A young man named Musa took the stand. He had entered the mines at just 8 years old. Now 23, his lungs were scarred from years of inhaling dust. Struggling to breathe, he told the judges, "They stole my childhood. They stole my strength. They stole my future." His words echoed through the hall. Then came Mariam, an elderly woman wrapped in a faded scarf. Her village had been wiped off the map to make way for a mine. The graves of her ancestors were bulldozed. Her home was gone. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "They destroyed everything we had. And what did we receive in return? A few dirty bills." The courtroom fell silent as she broke into tears. The evidence kept piling up. Internal emails from the companies revealed their true feelings. They called Africans stupid natives. They wrote that miners could be made to dance for a few dollars. One CEO compared child workers to cheap tools. Another memo coldly explained that cyanide dumping would go unnoticed because these people don't live long anyway. When these documents were read aloud, Traoré himself sat in the front row, quiet but unshaken. His hands tightened into fists, but he did not interrupt. He simply stared at the accused, face to face, as if to say, "The mask is gone. The world now sees who you really are." For the first time, global television audiences were not hearing about African suffering in abstract numbers. They were hearing voices, names, faces, living proof of what had been done. The crimes were no longer invisible. They were undeniable. This was not just a trial of 7 men. It was a trial of an entire system, and the world was watching. 6 months after the arrests, the courtroom reached its climax. The judges returned, the audience hushed, and the air seemed to freeze. For years, people in Burkina Faso had been told that justice was not for them, that the rich would never be punished, that the powerful would always escape. But on this day, in this courtroom, the verdict proved otherwise. One by one, the charges were read. The head of Goldmax was found guilty on hundreds of counts: bribery, theft, illegal land grabs, destruction of communities. The CEO of Western Gold was convicted of exploiting children, forcing them into mines where many never lived to see adulthood. The Australian executive who had approved cyanide mining was sentenced for poisoning rivers, sickening entire villages, and causing countless deaths. The sentences were heavy, decades in prison, some even life behind bars, but the punishment did not end there. The court stripped the executives of everything: mansions, yachts, private jets, secret bank accounts, even their art collections. Gone, seized by the state. And then came the twist. The money raised from selling those assets would not go to governments, not to politicians, not to corporations. It would go directly to the victims, the miners, the families, the communities who had suffered for generations. When the judges spoke the word guilty, the people outside erupted. Tens of thousands filled the streets with tears, songs, and chants of joy. For the first time, the billionaires were the ones in chains, and ordinary people were finally free. But Traoré was not finished. Justice in court was only the first step. The second was rebuilding the nation. He moved quickly, faster than anyone expected. Every foreign mining asset in the country was seized and placed under national control. The Burkina Faso National Mining Company was created, a state-owned powerhouse built to serve the people instead of foreign banks. The results were immediate. 70% of the revenue from gold now flowed directly into public projects. Schools were built where there had been none. Hospitals rose in regions that had been neglected for decades. Roads cut through mountains and villages once isolated from the rest of the country. For the first time, clean water reached millions. Workers' lives changed overnight. Salaries multiplied. Child labor was banned. Safety equipment was provided. Fatal accidents in the mines, once common, dropped to zero. Families who had known nothing but hunger began to live with dignity. The economy exploded with new life. Growth rates soared. Poverty fell at record speed. Numbers that had once been used to measure despair now measured progress. But behind the statistics were human stories. Children going to school for the first time, mothers receiving proper health care, elders walking on paved roads they had never dreamed of. This was more than reform. It was a rebirth. Burkina Faso was no longer a land of extraction and despair. It was becoming a land of hope, dignity, and strength. And around the world, people were watching. What began in Burkina Faso did not stay in Burkina Faso. Like a spark landing on dry grass, it spread quickly across the continent. Leaders in neighboring countries looked at what Traoré had done and realized the impossible was now possible. Mali opened investigations into its foreign mining giants. Guinea moved to take back control of its bauxite industry. Niger announced state ownership of its uranium mines. For the first time, African governments were acting not as subjects, but as sovereign nations. The ripple effects shook the global economy. Stocks of the biggest mining companies plummeted. Investors panicked. The mighty corporations that once dictated terms to entire countries now faced collapse. Goldmax lost most of its market value. Western gold barely survived. Pacific Resources shut down its operations across Africa entirely. What had seemed untouchable only months before was now crumbling piece by piece. In Europe, panic spread inside government halls. Emergency meetings were called. Phones rang late into the night. Leaders whispered about sanctions, threats, retaliation. But beneath the panic was fear. The fear that the old order, built on centuries of plunder, was slipping away. Western leaders shouted their warnings. "You will pay," Macron had said. "We will cut you off," declared Washington. But in Ouagadougou, the answer remained steady. Africa would no longer live on its knees. "We are not enemies to anyone," Traoré said. "Our doors are open to those who want fair trade, but the era of exploitation is over." On the ground, the proof was undeniable. Children were no longer choking on dust deep inside mines. They were in classrooms, holding pencils instead of shovels. Miners were no longer scraping by on starvation wages. They were earning enough to build homes, feed families, and live with dignity. Villages once poisoned by chemicals were receiving clean water. For ordinary people, this was not a political slogan. It was daily life transformed. Festivals lit up towns that had been silent for years. Mothers cried tears of relief. Fathers lifted their children onto their shoulders. Elders raised their fists in pride. The name of Traoré was sung in chants and carved into banners. He had done what others only dreamed. He had returned the nation's wealth to its people. And yet, Traoré reminded his people that the struggle was not over. "Today we put 7 men on trial," he declared on the courthouse steps. "But in truth, we put 500 years of theft on trial, and today, Africa won." His words traveled far beyond Burkina Faso, carried by radio, television, and social media to every corner of the globe. In Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East, communities facing their own battles against exploitation looked to Africa with new hope. If Burkina Faso could stand up, maybe they could too. The message was simple but powerful. Africa's resources belong to its people. Its future will not be written by foreign hands, but by its own children. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter of dignity, justice, and freedom. And the world could no longer look away.